What makes us who we are as a country, as a people? What makes us Americans? It's a question I ask myself a lot. It's the big question of my professional life. And the answer isn't obvious. We have no single ethnicity, no shared religion. We come from all different parts of the world, with all different backgrounds. But there's one thing we all have in common. It's what I teach about. It's the Constitution. And that's the answer. The Constitution is what makes us Americans. It's what creates us, what constitutes us as a nation. And it's more than that. The Constitution, you could say, is our sacred text. It's the basis of our civic religion. We have no official religion. The Constitution actually says we can't have one. But we have something very close to it. The Constitution says there can be no religious tests for public office. But it requires officials to swear allegiance to something, itself. Every official must take an oath to support the Constitution. So the Constitution is our central organizing document. It's what we build our society around. It gives us our values. It tells us what's worth fighting for. It tells us who we are. And there's a story that we like to tell ourselves about the Constitution and our relationship to it. The story says that a long time ago, back in 1776, some great men wrote down some wonderful principles in the Declaration of Independence. They called these self-evident truths. All men are created equal. They have inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And our founders fought a war for those principles, and they built a nation around them. And the Constitution was their vehicle for carrying those principles into execution. And for more than 200 years, our Constitution has served us well because of the wisdom of our founders. Our task as Americans is to respect their wisdom and live up to the principles they adopted, the principles for which they fought and died. If we do that, we'll enjoy a fair and just society where everyone can thrive. That's what I'm going to call the standard story. The founders were wise. We need to be faithful to their principles. American history starts on a high note, and we're trying to sustain it. That's what I used to teach my constitutional law students. It's what we're all taught. It's what I was taught, and I didn't know any better. But one day, some of my students came to me, some of my African American students, and they said, you know, that's not how American history started for us. We're not included in the Declaration. We're not included in the Founders' Constitution. And my immediate reaction to that was another part of the standard story, which is that the Declaration sets out aspirations. Yes, the founders talked about liberty and equality while owning slaves, but they knew that was wrong. And in the Declaration, they set out principles that they couldn't live up to, but that they hoped might be fully realized in the future. We can fulfill their aspirations and prove ourselves worthy of them. But my students didn't just accept that. They said, prove ourselves worthy of Thomas Jefferson? Fulfill his aspirations? Really? The man owned 700 slaves, and the only ones he freed when he died were his children. That's true. So that made me think about it some more. And it occurred to me, our standard story really isn't that inspiring after all. It tells us American history starts with a lie. It tells us the Declaration of Independence is a statement of principles dishonored by the men who announced them. Self-evident truths that actually weren't worth paying attention to. That's what the standard story amounts to. But what I've realized in the past few years is, this standard story isn't true, after all. That's not who our founders were. Pious hypocrites, people announcing things they didn't believe in. They were both better and worse than that. They announced principles they believed in, principles they honored, and principles that justified their revolution. They just aren't the principles we follow today. So the standard story, which tries to draw a line from the Declaration of Independence in the past to us in the present, that story is at best a myth. At worst, it's a lie. And what I want to do in this talk is to tell you the truth. I'm going to tell you where the line that you draw from the Declaration really goes. I'm going to tell you the truth about the principles America was founded on, the principles Americans fought for in 1776 and more recently. and the truth about what our duty as Americans really is, the truth about, fundamentally, who we are. This is a more complicated story than the one we usually like to tell ourselves. It's sadder in some ways, but I think in the end it's more hopeful too, and it has more faith in the potential and the fundamental goodness of we the people. So here we go. The first thing we need to do is to see the Declaration of Independence clearly. Our standard story tells us it announced broad principles of liberty and equality, principles that were inconsistent with the slavery practiced by its signers. And I'm here to tell you that's wrong. The Declaration announced narrow principles that are fully consistent with slavery. To see this, we need to think about why the Declaration says what it does about liberty and equality, and what exactly it means. The Declaration of Independence is not Thomas Jefferson's moral philosophy term paper. It's not his general ideas about how people should treat each other in some abstract context. The Declaration is written by people who are trying to justify a revolution. And it's about one thing only, which is when people have a duty to obey their government and when they have a right to rebel. That's what those principles relate to. All men are created equal. That means there are no kings. It means no one can justify authority by saying, I was born to rule you. People have inalienable rights. Again, this is about justifying authority. It means that the ruler can't foreclose rebellion by saying, no matter what I do, you gave up your rights to me. You surrendered your freedom. That's what it means to say those rights are inalienable. So if we think about these principles in their context, in terms of the work they're supposed to do in justifying rebellion, we can see they're much more limited than people think nowadays. The Declaration's concept of equality means there are no kings. Its concept of inalienable liberty means that people can't surrender their freedom. But slave owners never claimed to be kings, just masters. They never claimed that slaves had voluntarily surrendered their freedom, just that it had been taken. They never claimed that slaves had a political duty to obey, just that they would be punished if they didn't. So the argument of the Declaration, which is about when that political duty to obey the government exists, has no effect on slavery. But, you might say, haven't the Declaration's principles blossomed over time? Haven't they inspired successive generations, people like Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King? Yes, some good people have quoted the words. But what I've just said to you is that the substance of the Declaration doesn't actually support Lincoln and King in the way that they claimed. If you want to look for people who really stood up for the principles of the Declaration, you can find them in American history. But you won't find them in the civil rights movement. You find them in the Confederate States of America, the rebel South. You don't hear this so much, but the Southern states overwhelmingly invoked the Declaration of Independence in their secession letters. And they were right to. The fundamental theory of the Declaration is that people create governments to protect certain rights. And if the governments threaten those rights, people can rebel. The Southern states joined the Revolution, and later the Union, to protect some rights they valued. And high on that list was the right to own slaves. They might well have feared the British would take that right away from them. And when they started to fear the federal government would take it away, they left the Union, just as they had left the Empire. They started the Second American Revolution. This Second American Revolution was, of course, the Civil War. But this time, the rebels lost. That revolution was put down. And we are the heirs, politically, constitutionally. We are the heirs not of those second revolutionaries, but of the people who stopped them. What does that mean for who we are? It means three things. First, American identity doesn't come from the Declaration of Independence. If you draw a line from the Declaration of Independence, it doesn't go to us. It goes to the rebel South, and it stops there. The central ideal of the Declaration is the right of rebellion. That died at Gettysburg, when Pickett's charge failed to break the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. The central ideal of the Declaration is dead, and we're the ones who killed it. Yes, us. Who won the Civil War? The answer is not the North. The answer is we the people of the United States. Second, our American identity doesn't come from the Founders' Constitution, that document written in Philadelphia, the hot summer of 1787. The Founders' Constitution tells you its goals in the preamble: to form a more perfect union, to ensure domestic tranquility, to secure the blessings of liberty. How did that work out? Not even 80 years later, state warred against state, brother against brother. Americans killed Americans, 750,000. The Founders' Constitution was a failure. We don't like to say this. We talk about the success of our Constitution, how it served us well for over 200 years. We do this often without even mentioning the Civil War. Apart from that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you like the play? So if it's not the Declaration and it's not the Founders, where does our identity come from? What tells us who we are? Here's the third point. I said the Civil War is the end of the ideals of the Declaration, and it's the end of the Founders' Constitution. But it's not the end of America. We get a new Constitution. We get the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, the 15th, and most important, the 14th. And these give us a totally new political structure. It's the 14th Amendment that protects individuals from states, not just the federal government. It's the 14th Amendment that gives us a right to equality. And it's the 14th Amendment that gives us our most famous Supreme Court cases, the decisions that define constitutional law for us nowadays. Cases about racial segregation, Brown v. Board of Education, about interracial marriage, Loving against Virginia, about the rights of criminal defendants, Miranda and Gideon, about the rights of gays and lesbians, Lawrence v. Texas, Obergefell against Hodges. Those decisions don't exist in the Founders' world. They're part of a different America, the new birth of freedom that Lincoln promised in the Gettysburg Address. We live under the Reconstruction Constitution, not the Founders' Constitution. It's the Reconstruction Constitution that tells us there are no slaves here. It's the Reconstruction Constitution that promises equality to all people. It's the Reconstruction Constitution that tells us who we are. So what does all this mean for us today? One thing it means is that in our civic religion of the Constitution, we should pay less attention to the founding and more to Reconstruction. We should venerate Thomas Jefferson less and Abraham Lincoln more. We should honor not just the men who fought at Lexington and Yorktown, but those who fought at Shiloh and Antietam. Those men, the Union soldiers, are the ones who gave us our rights. But more important, it means something about the story of who we are. It means the story of America is not a story of success, not a smooth glide into the future, propelled by the wisdom of the past. It's failure after failure, crisis after crisis. That probably doesn't sound so encouraging. I'm here to tell you the story of us is a story of failure. Not so upbeat on the surface. But if you think about it, it is. And here's why. Look around you at America today. Do you think things are going well? Do you think we're on the right path? Most Americans don't, and they've got reasons. Things are a mess. Our government is dysfunctional. Our republic totters. And if you thought that the founders gave us all the answers, and things have been great up until now, you'd probably think we're in serious trouble. We must have strayed from the wisdom of the founders. We must have wandered off the right path. Maybe, for the first time in our history, we're headed for disaster. But what I've told you today is that this is how things have always been, over and over again. Struggle and crisis are not new. Even failure is not new. This is the same road we've always been on. It's a long road, and it's not a straight one, but in the end it will take us where we are going. Now I admit, I've had my doubts. Years ago, almost 10 years now, I was asked to be a constitutional law consultant on a Guantanamo case. And I went to Guantanamo, and I stood in the interrogation rooms, and I learned all the things the government had done to keep me safe. all the things my government had done in my name. And I shed some tears over that. I was standing there, looking at the guard towers draped with American flags, because that's one of the striking things about Guantanamo. It's just covered in flags. And I found myself wondering, is this America? Is this really who we are? I kept thinking about that question after I went back home. I wanted to learn more about what we do in times of fear, how America responds to that. I understand things a lot in terms of stories. I think most people do. So I started writing a novel about World War II and the detention of the Japanese Americans. And here's a story I learned about. Once there was a little girl, a Japanese American girl. She was born in California in about 1935. When she was still very young, her parents sent her to Japan to be educated. A lot of the Japanese American families did that. But this little girl didn't like it there. She missed her white friends. So her parents brought her back home. And this was about 1940, 1941. So you know what happens then. Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. President Roosevelt issues Executive Order 9066. Innocent Japanese Americans are taken from their homes and placed in camps in the interior of the country. And this little girl, again, is separated from her white friends, surrounded by ethnic Japanese, and she thinks she's back in Japan. She says to her mother, over and over, "I want to go home. I want to go back to America." Her mother says, "This is America." But the girl doesn't believe her. And her mother is searching for a way to convince her. So what does she do? She points to the flags in the guard towers, the American flags. "See the flags, my daughter? This is America." And I had a reaction when I read that. The same feeling I had standing there in Guantanamo. I wanted to say, no, that's not America. That's not who we are. America starts with noble ideals, and America means preserving them over time. I wanted to tell myself what I've been calling the standard story. But what I've tried to tell you today is that standard story is not the true story of America. The truth is, we start with some bad stuff, and our history is actually full of it. Our story is a struggle, and there is blood and death and suffering. There is injustice, and there is evil. There are slave ships for kidnapped Africans, and desert camps for Japanese Americans, and interrogation rooms for the secret prisoners of Guantanamo Bay. But there is also hope. There's Abraham Lincoln, and there's Martin Luther King, and there's always hope. When things are going wrong, we all look around and think, this isn't America. And the answer is, this is only America if you let it be, because America is what you make it. Our story is a struggle, yes, but more fundamentally, it's a story of survival, and it's a story of improvement. We get better. We become more who we are meant to be. We get closer to our best selves. America is a progress. And so the point that all this leads to is that the true America, the end of the road we travel, the city on the hill, is not something that's given to us by founding fathers. It's something we make, something we find inside ourselves. The true America is not handed down from the past, but created anew by each generation, created a little better. And what we can give the future is the opportunity to get just a little closer than we did ourselves. That is the promise we make when we take that oath to support the Constitution. That is the covenant that runs from generation to generation and binds us into one people. It is the promise we will be better in the future. The promise we can always be renewed. Thank you.